Cablevision Channel 24, your community programming channel.
Good afternoon. That afternoon was okay that good afternoon was okay for me, but we do have Lisa Wilmot, George Forbes, Avery Friedman, and Julian Bond, and I think we ought to do a little better for them, not for me. So good afternoon. Oh, okay. My name is Wynn Ritchie, and I'm the Vice Mayor of Shaker Heights, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here today, particularly the real estate industry. I'd also like to send greetings from the Shaker City Council, but I think maybe most important, I'd like to thank you all for the job you have done in creating and participating in Shaker's racial diversity. I believe gathered here today is maybe the finest team in America as far as working towards the American dream of one nation indivisible. So I thought maybe before we get into the formal program, we might ask each of you to stand and greet and congratulate the person on either side of you and maybe in front of you and behind you, and then give yourselves a rousing ovation for the job you have done in helping us achieve what we have achieved. So would you greet each other and I know when I speak to groups like that, I like to start that way because then I know they're at least awake when I start talking anyhow. We have two challenges before us as we today. First of all, I think we have to continue to do all the things that we have been doing that has made Shaker what it is today. We must continue because the battle isn't over, and I think you all know that. But the other thing I think we must try to do, and that is try to influence communities in and around greater Cleveland that maybe this way of life is a good way of life. We need to replicate what we have, and we need to sell the issue of diversity to other communities. I think if we do that, in the process, we will show people that integration is good, it's the way it ought to be, and I think it's one of the real issues that will help us solve the racial problems that plague America. So I say to you, go team, keep up the good work. And now, Lisa Wilmot will come forward, the Assistant Law Director. She's also the Fair Housing Administrator for the City of Shaker Heights, and she's also the one that instrumented and put this all together and arranged the whole thing. Lisa, thank you.
Good morning. I'm so glad to see the turnout here. We all have been working very hard to try and make today a very successful event, and I want to thank you for your participation in today's event. As Dr. Ritchie stated, my name is Lisa Wilmot, and I'm the Assistant Director of Law and the Fair Housing Board of Review Administrator. And as most of you know, Shaker Heights has a deep and rich tradition of affirmatively furthering fair housing. Approximately a year and a half ago, the city applied for and was granted substantial equivalency from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Basically, what that means is that our city ordinance is the same as or substantially equivalent to the Federal Fair Housing Act. One of the benefits of this status is the fact that we are now considered to be an enforcement arm for HUD. That means that any fair housing complaints that arise within the city of Shaker Heights can be filed with our office, will be investigated in our office, and if necessary and warranted, prosecution will come from our office for those complaints. When we were originally awarded the status approximately a year and a half ago, We were the first city in the North to achieve such a status. Also the first city in Ohio. Since that time, Dayton recently has also been awarded substantial equivalency status. One of our goals under the substantial equivalency is that we realize that enforcement is not the only way to educate people on fair housing. The best way to do that is through outreach programs such as the one is today, and that's why we're here today. Through the substantial equivalency status, we have received a grant from HUD, which has enabled us to do some very innovative programming. First and foremost, we have been able to work with the local school board and have developed a curriculum on fair housing, which has currently been incorporated into the 11th grade American history classes and the 12th grade government classes. We are the first city in the nation to take this step and to have that incorporated into our local school curriculum. Additionally, through the funding that we have received, we have been able to sponsor events such as these and hope to continue to do so in the past. We realize that we still need to continue to grow in this area and hope that we can encourage other municipalities to achieve substantial equivalency status for themselves. At this time, once again, I'd like to thank you for being here. I'd like to thank especially Reverend Hellwig and Roy Sherman from the First Baptist Church who made today possible for us. And I'd like to introduce to you Mr. George Forbes, who is the president of the NAACP for the Cleveland chapter. Mr. Forbes.
Morning, everybody. If you noticed, I was seated over here, and Avery decided he didn't want all the black folks on this side, that we ought to go over and integrate on the other side. So that's why I moved. I have always admired the position that the officials and the people in Shaker Heights had taken on fair and integrated housing during the time that we were trying to pass an ordinance in Cleveland to fair housing ordinance. You had for some years a policy of balanced approach to housing, and it was something that always made sense to me. I see Walter Kelly here, and I know there were times you were criticized about it, but one of the things that I wanted to say to you this morning, I always thought that it was a common sense approach, it was a practical approach to solving a very vexing problem. And I wanted to congratulate you, Walter, and the mayor this morning for that policy that you all put into effect before anyone else was doing it. I want to pay respect to my dear friend Avery Friedman, who has devoted his life and his career to the concept of fair and integrated housing. He took a belief and he put it into practice, and probably he's the foremost authority in this country on housing as it pertains to discrimination. And I wanted to come out this morning and give my respects to him. Finally, let me mention just briefly about Julian. It was out of the South and out of cities like Atlanta and Birmingham that the civil rights movement started, and it was with the Bond family in particular, and Julian was a very young man, along with Martin Luther King, that the whole concept of civil rights was started, and the marches were made, and the leadership came out of black folks in the South. And it was put together with Northern money and Northern liberals and Northern white people who felt that there should be a change in our country. And if we approach our concept of living today from that angle, and you'd be surprised, I know that has been basically my concept to reduce and resolve black problems with white liberals and white people who want to do well. And I find that there's nothing but greatness that can come for our country as long as we approach it from that angle. Blacks cannot do it alone. We must have the help from white people. And that is how the civil rights movement started. The young men and women in the South put together with white help throughout our country. And out of that came the Fair Housing Law. Some 6 or 7 years later, that law was put into effect. And out of that came the Shaker Plan. And out of that, we're here this morning to hear Julian talk to us about it. Thank you very much.
2 million Americans every year get the door slammed in their face. At least that's what a recent federal study showed in examining whether or not fair housing laws are being complied with. Well, as we know, there is only one reason America has a fair housing law, and that was as a direct consequence of the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. a quarter of a century and 1 year ago this month. The passage of the law, reaction to the riots which were triggered after the murder, created a legacy to Dr. King's dream in the embodiment of Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. And it is a law, according to the two senators who drafted it, Senator Javits and Senator Mondale in 1968. But the objective was to replace the ghettos, black and white, with balanced integrated living patterns. If an individual lives the spirit of Dr. King's dream and what the Fair Housing Act is about, it is your speaker today. He is a Renaissance person whose activities have been as diverse and as broad as anyone in the American human rights movement has been. From being nominated Vice President of the United States at the Democratic National Convention to hosting NBC's Saturday Night Live. Doesn't get any more diverse than that. Substantively teaching at Harvard and some of the best schools in our country, to presently serving on the faculty at American University and the University of Virginia right now. He is more than just a person who has been involved, but also an inspiration to so many of us that have devoted our lives to the concept of American human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, Julian Bond.
Thank you a great deal for that kind introduction. I know you've heard it said by many, many speakers before what a great pleasure it is to be here. And so it is a great pleasure to be here. It is a pleasure for me to be here for many different reasons and in many different ways. A moment ago, Avery and I drove past the former home of Senator Howard Metzenbaum, and I remembered having been in that home years and years ago when the senator was gracious enough to host the kind of fundraising party that George Forbes mentioned a moment ago to raise money for the movement in the South. And it's just a great, great treat to go past that lovely home once again. It's always a great, great pleasure for me to be in Shaker Heights. I have relatives here and have known for years and years the reputation this city has enjoyed. It's a treat to be here. It's a great pleasure to share the podium with George Forbes, who is a giant in urban politics in the United States, and I just hope I can learn from him and make myself into a better person. It's a great, great treat to be here because I'm pleased to celebrate what Attorney Wilmot just called this city's long and rich tradition of fairness in housing. And last but not least, because Avery Friedman is one of that small band of advocates who has tried to make that deep and rich tradition part of the American tradition. As George Forbes has said, he is a true giant in this field. I want to talk briefly, I hope, about fair housing, its history, its present status, and some future possibilities. It was 45 years ago that the Congress of the United States promised in the Housing Act of 1949 a decent home and a suitable living environment for every family. No survey or national census is required today to discover how far we yet remain from that goal after 4.5 decades have passed. For the American family, white, black, or brown, for most black or brown Americans in families or living singly, for families white, brown, or black with children, for renters in public subsidized or private housing, for female heads of household, for the disabled, the promise of a suitable living environment still remains a distant dream. For these Americans, and for many, many more, a house is seldom a home, and a decent home remains a dream deferred. Each year at this time, we observe Fair Housing Month, Our observance this year, the 26th anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, is marked by a sense of both regret and renewal. Regret because there are millions of instances of housing discrimination in the United States each year. As a result, the number of fair housing complaints in 1991, the last year for which such statistics are available, stood at 9,000. That represented a 21% increase over 1990. Complaints were received from every state in the country, including 560 from this state. Regret because the Department of Housing and Urban Development says that black families who want to buy a home stand a 59% chance of encountering housing discrimination. The figure for Hispanic home buyers is 56%. Regret because black and Hispanics looking for rental housing have a 50% chance of facing a door closed because of discrimination. Regret because complaints of discrimination against women are both numerous and increasing, and include allegations of sexual harassment. Regret because 25% of our nation's rental units close their doors to families with children. Regret because segregated housing segregates 2 out of 3 black children into attending black majority schools, almost 40 years after a unanimous Supreme Court declared, in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Regret because a 1992 study conducted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston found that credit-worthy black and Hispanic mortgage applicants are rejected 56% more often than equally qualified whites. Regret because each year a certain number of housing-related civil rights violations rise to the level of criminal conduct, including recently cross burnings at a house in a predominantly white suburb of Chicago whose white owners had blacks as guests in their home, threatening letters containing anti-Semitic remarks sent to a Jewish family in New Jersey, and in Virginia, the arson of property being purchased by a black man, followed by the shooting death of a witness to that arson. But fortunately, these regrets are now being tempered by renewal. Renewal because for the first time in 12 years, an administration in Washington stands for freedom and fairness in housing, and not with discrimination and despair. Renewal because this January, President Clinton issued an executive order establishing a cabinet-level Fair Housing Council to set a coordinated strategy to affirmatively further fair housing. Renewal because the Clinton Justice Department has undertaken a major expansion of the Civil Rights Division's housing section. Renewal because HUD has pledged to revamp its enforcement process, to favor complainants, and has already initiated more investigations of housing discrimination under Secretary Cisneros than in the prior 10 years. Renewal because for the first time ever, HUD has taken control of a local public housing authority because of civil rights violations. Renewal because upwards of 20,000 young women and men may earn educational awards this year through a national service program by working in communities, building housing, cleaning parks, providing other needed services. And renewal because the administration has proposed spending $234 million over the next 5 years to relocate thousands of low-income families from inner cities into more affluent neighborhoods. Renewal because eliminating bias in mortgage lending is another administration goal. Renewal because in settling another Justice Department lawsuit, the owners and managers of a Detroit area apartment complex agreed to pay the largest civil penalty ever imposed in a housing discrimination case. Renewal because Fannie Mae has announced it will make $1 trillion available to low and moderate income housing, and will also spend millions to combat racial discrimination in mortgage lending. Renewal because Fleet Finance, a Georgia subsidiary of the largest bank in New England, agreed in January to pay $115 million to avoid an investigation into charges that had bilked and cheated poor homeowners with high-interest mortgages. For most of this century, regret, unfortunately, has been the fair housing standard. Renewal is a recent phenomenon. 100 years ago, America's cities were relatively integrated, at least in comparison to the apartheid system an unprotected buyer or renter faces today. A quick review will demonstrate how recently our patterns of residential apartheid have emerged, and how this segregation was the deliberate creation of official policies and practices of the United States. Robert Weaver showed that New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Richmond, San Diego, Columbus, Pittsburgh all had only limited patterns of housing segregation early in the 20th century. Gunnar Myrdal demonstrated that as late as the 1930s, fewer than 5% of residential blocks in northern cities were occupied exclusively by non-whites. Du Bois' study of Philadelphia saw blacks living in every ward of that city as late as 1897. And my uncle J. Max Bond wrote of similar dispersal patterns in Los Angeles in 1890. But as white flight began to populate the new suburbs, racial zoning strung a white noose around the inner city, an invisible cord which kept Asians and blacks out. When Jim Crow zoning was declared illegal in 1917, restrictive covenants followed. Developers and homeowners agreed not to sell or rent to non-whites, and the white noose grew tighter. Before these devices were found unconstitutional in 1948, they had created two housing markets, one for whites, another for blacks. Then the federal government became a more active participant in the drive to create two separate Americas. The FHA, HUD's predecessor, required racial restrictions in New Deal home ownership programs. A 1935 FHA underwriting manual made it clear. What the federal government called inharmonious racial or nationality groups were to be discouraged from moving into all-white communities. The interstate highway system gave the states money, which made white flight to segregated suburbs easier, and other federal grants for sewage, electric power, open space were given to discriminating suburban towns on the urban fringe. Highways, sewers, power transmission lines encouraged the spread of industry away from the city, as did the lower price of land. And the ebony urbanite left behind found fewer jobs and fewer services as tax levels began to drop as well. Public housing programs began to destroy older integrated neighborhoods, replacing them with segregated buildings which offered the least shelter at the lowest cost. Urban renewal, of course, has been Negro removal since its inception in 1949. Thus, Uncle Sam took up the fight white private parties had begun, and in the process began to codify in the public mind the myth that integrated neighborhoods and lower real estate values went hand in hand. Private parties played an important role too. Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data from 1978 through 1990 confirmed that less mortgage credit flows to low-income and mostly black or Hispanic neighborhoods than to upper-income and white neighborhoods. Blacks are 2/3 more likely than whites to be rejected for loans, even controlling for income. The difference between the Hispanic and white rejection rates is almost as large. The Boston Fed study I referred to earlier sought to build on this data by collecting information on all objective indicators of applicant risk for more than 3,000 loan applications from throughout the Boston area. After accounting for every factor considered to be a legitimate reason to deny a loan, the rejection rate for blacks was more than 50% greater than for whites. If this was not proof enough that discrimination was at work, the study also found that about 4/5 of all applications do not perfectly fit the applicable underwriting standards. Thus, in most cases, the individual underwriter or loan officer uses discretion in making decisions. In effect, lending money to home buyers is an expression of faith. Faith in the borrower, faith in the property, faith in the neighborhood. In the United States, such questions of faith historically have been influenced by race. That influence used to be easily defined with a list. In 1933, a respected economist at the University of Chicago, Homer Hoyt, published a list of racial groups. See if you can find yourselves in these lists, ranking them from positive to negative influence on property values. The first, most highly valued were English, Scotch, Irish, Scandinavian. Next, Northern Italians. Next, Bohemians or Czechs. Next, Poles. Next, Lithuanians. Next, Greeks. Next, Russians, Jews, particularly lower-class Jews. Next, Southern Italians. Next, Negroes. And last, Mexicans. The next year, he was hired by the federal government to develop the first underwriting criteria. Who's a good credit risk, who isn't, for the new Federal Housing Administration. His list wasn't included, but warnings on racial influence were. These same views were included in the first text of the American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers in 1933, which warned appraisers of the harm done to property values by the infiltration of inharmonious racial groups. The list appeared in the Bible of appraising, Mike Michael's appraising manual, as late as 1975. But the appraisers were not alone. The prevailing racism in society was institutionalized in the rules of bankers and real estate agents, too. The National Association of Realtors developed a code of behavior forbidding members from selling homes in white areas to minority buyers. These racial views persisted through the Civil Rights era. Publications from HUD, the parent of the FHA, reflected Hoyt's views as late as '75. In that year, The Dynamics of Change, a HUD publication, defined racial change, or the fear of racial change, as the most significant predictor of what they called incipient decline. As late as 1977, it took a lawsuit from the Justice Department before such racial standards were purged from the guidelines of the Society of Real Estate Appraisers, the Mortgage Bankers Association of America, the American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers, the United States League of Savings Associations. Appraisers opposed the settlement, contending their right to free speech was abridged if they could not consider the effect of race on their appraisals. Just 3 years ago, in 1991, the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation examined focus groups of 147 individuals from 133 leading institutions, lending institutions in 12 cities. The results showed that racial prejudice by loan officers and their perceptions of underwriting criteria contribute to race discrimination in mortgage lending. The Ghettos Foundation is institutionalized discrimination in the real estate and banking industries. Its pilings are individual prejudice and discrimination, and its co-builder was the federal government itself. From the FHA and its predecessor agencies, where discrimination in home lending originated, to subsidizing the creation of white suburbs through mortgage interest deductions and the denial of credit to inner cities, from the promotion of white flight by the placement of highways to the use of urban renewal and public housing to isolate blacks. The latest census tells us that 30% of the nation's blacks still live in near total segregation, with more than 9 million living in neighborhoods that are at least 90% black. 68% of whites live in virtually all white areas. This is down from 76% in 1980, due largely to suburbia's growing numbers of Asians and Hispanics, who historically have faced fewer barriers than blacks. During his campaign for the presidency in 1960, John F. Kennedy promised, if elected, to eliminate housing segregation with the stroke of a pen. He must have used invisible ink. The executive order he signed applied only to federally assisted housing built after November '62, covered less than 1% of then existing housing, and less than 15% of new construction. In short, it had little effect on housing constructed and segregated over past decades with the consent and complicity of the government of the United States. This sorry scenario began to change in 1966, when legislation was introduced in Congress to end racial discrimination in housing throughout the country. Despite the earlier successes of the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, compassion in Congress had cooled, the effort barely begun. It was one thing to work next to a black person, another thing to live next door to one. When Congress passed the '64 Act, which outlawed discrimination in employment and in federally funded organizations, it specifically excluded programs of federal mortgage insurance from coverage, thereby perpetuating pervasive discrimination. The forces for civil rights began to beat a disorderly retreat and shifted their aim from broad targets to those that seemed politically palatable. The Civil Rights Act of 1968, of which Title VIII, the Fair Housing Act, was to become an important part, began in '67 as a mild attempt to protect blacks and those engaged in civil rights work from racially motivated violence. Indeed, even a strong supporter of equal rights, Wisconsin Representative Robert Kastemeyer told his colleagues in the House that passage of this bill will have little or no effect on the average American Negro. The bill did pass the House, was reported to the Senate, and with slight changes reported by the Senate Judiciary Committee in November '67. Debate in the Senate began in January '68, and while it blundered on, President Lyndon B. Johnson sent Congress a special message on civil rights, calling for a much broader measure, including a national fair housing law. By the end of February, Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen of Illinois had changed his position on fair housing. His earlier opposition had kept the Senate from passing the '66 Act, but now Dirksen and the Senate Democratic leadership agreed to a compromise, and the Republican shift doomed the 33-day-long filibuster that had bottled up the bill. But the opponents were ready. North Carolina Senator Sam Erwin, who in just 4 years would become the Constitution's biggest defender at the Watergate hearings, said the Dirksen bill would rob Americans of their precious freedom to control the use and disposition of their privately owned property. A look back at the climate in which this debate occurred may be instructive. When the original legislation was introduced, there had been riots in more than 200 cities across the United States. We were then 4 years past the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, then the largest demonstration for any cause in the United States. We were 13 years away from the '54 decision integrating public education, and 2 years beyond the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War. But by 1967, civil rights had slipped off the American agenda. The energies extended in passing the '64 and '65 laws were dissipated, the commitment abandoned. With urban violence as an excuse, the half-hearted soldiers on the battleground for equal rights felt the ground they had gained had been sufficient, the recipients of their gifts ungrateful, and that the victories won had been enough. Then, as now, debates about rights became arguments about responsibilities. And then, as now, the opponents of equality clothed their bigotry in sophisticated garments called states' rights or federal intrusion. As Senator Robert Kennedy of New York said in debate in early '68, today our national focus is riveted on other urgent issues: a seemingly endless, debilitating war half a world away, violence and bloodshed on the streets of American cities, and a loss of faith in our purpose and our principles. On March 1st, '68, the Kerner Commission, more properly the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, issued its report. It said we were two societies in America, one largely black and poor, one largely white and rich, moving further and further apart. It called for, among other things, the passage of federal fair housing legislation to cover the rental and sale of all housing, including single-family homes. 3 days later, on March 4th, the Senate voted to end the filibuster by the smallest possible margin, 65 to 32. With cloture voted, passage of the bill became certain. The only question unresolved whether its opponents, North and South, would succeed in attaching crippling amendments. One of the most devastating was the effort by Tennessee Republican Howard Baker, who tried to exempt privately owned single-family housing from the bill's coverage. But, as finally approved by the Senate, the bill promised to eliminate housing segregation in 3 steps. The measure went back to the House, which delayed action, and set its vote for April 9, 1968. But 5 days before, as Avery Friedman has mentioned, on April 4, 1968, James Earl Ray shot the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. April 9th, was his funeral day. And on that day, the House Rules Committee cleared the way to send the bill to the House floor on April 10th. After 1 hour of debate, it passed 229 to 195. Only 2 months after the House vote, the U.S. Supreme Court reminded us we already had a 100-year-old open housing law already on the federal statute books. The court revived the Civil Rights Act of 1866, ruling that it barred racial discrimination in all housing throughout the United States. Thus, in 1968, we had 2 fair housing laws, one dating from Reconstruction, placing a broadside ban against discrimination in the sale and rental of all housing, and the other enacted over a century later, barring discrimination based on race, religion, or national origin, but limited to coverage of 77% of the then 69 million housing units in the United States. And once again, the promise would be broken, the dream would be deferred. As the price of its passage, the Fair Housing Act was designed not to work. Its ban on discrimination in housing was destined to be an empty promise. As one commentator put it, what Congress did was hatch a beautiful bird without wings to fly. In its original version, it would have given HUD substantial enforcement powers. As passed, it only gave them the authority to investigate complaints made by aggrieved persons and to engage in conference, conciliation, and persuasion to resolve a problem. It could not force compliance with the law, grant a remedy, assess damages, enjoin a prohibited practice from continuing, or penalize the lawbreaker in any way. The beautiful bird had no teeth or claws. HUD could only refer a case to the Justice Department, which in turn could only act in the face of a pattern or practice of discrimination, or if the alleged discrimination raised an issue of general public importance. The late Patricia Harris, HUD Secretary under President Carter, said the '68 Fair Housing Act reduced HUD to asking the lawbreaker whether he wants to discuss the matter. During the 70s and the 80s, even the most blatant lawbreakers had little to fear from HUD or the Justice Department. The 1980s were a vast wasteland in the field of civil rights and equal opportunity, and for those of us who believe that government must be fair, honest, and open. A band of ideological profiteers descended on Washington and the Treasury like a crazed swarm of right-wing locusts, destroying the rules and the laws which protect our people from poisoned air and water, from bigotry, corruption, and greed. But nowhere was their contempt for the rule of law so great as in their attempt to subvert, ignore, and destroy the law that requires an integrated America, an America which is bias-free. When Congress and the Constitution said yes, they said no. They even perverted the language as they perverted the process. In their doublespeak, white men became the new victims of racism, just as unemployed mothers and underpaid school teachers replaced monopolist and economic royalist as special interest. As was true more than 100 years ago, the president entered into an illicit arrangement, not just with the unreconstructed South, but with the national unreconstructed mentality that believed then, as it does now, that private profit and public arrogance could be pursued at the expense of the people living on the economic edge. That president packed the federal bench with judges who were richer, younger, whiter, more conservative, and more male than each of the three presidents who had gone before. His domestic policies were based on triage economics, survival of the greediest, and despair for all others. The Reagan Justice Department was an oxymoron, attempting to return us to a mythical America yesteryear, when white men were the only real men, and women and all others knew their proper place. His Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, the person HUD referred to its fair housing cases, the once beautiful bird was being guarded by the fox. He reversed the stance of earlier administrations and argued in the Supreme Court that fair housing testers should not be eligible to file suit under the Fair Housing Act. He refused to change the Justice Department's test of discrimination from intent to effect. Luckily, on January 21st of this year, Attorney General Janet Reno announced that henceforth the department will use disparate impact or effect theory of discrimination in housing cases. Secretary Cisneros, earlier in an administrative ruling, adopted the disparate impact theory for use in the administration's adjudication of housing discrimination complaints. Because intent is so much more difficult to prove than effect, the use of one test over the other has enormous practical and legal significance. But with Reagan Reynolds at the helm, the number of cases prosecuted under the Act dropped precipitously. Between '68 and '78, the department prosecuted an average of 32 fair housing cases a year, an enormous number only when compared to the cases brought during the Reagan presidency. During his first year as president, not one fair housing case was filed. In 1982, only 2. This at a time when the number of complaints filed with HUD nearly doubled, from 2,879 to 5,182. The number of cases filed by the Reagan Justice Department tripled to 6 in 1983. At the end of his terms, The total number of housing cases during his 8 years equaled the annual average during each of President Carter's 4 years. The few cases they did prosecute were clearly not chosen to broaden the reach or extend the promise of the law. The Reagan administration, in concert with the National Association of Realtors, also worked to undermine HUD's already limited enforcement authority. The Office of Management and Budget even tried to restrict HUD's ability to gather racial data. Under the guise of the Paperwork Reduction Act, the OMB sought to eliminate boxes seeking race, sex, and ethnicity from HUD forms. These and other small-minded actions by small-minded men, taken by these counter-revolutionaries, eventually managed to anger even moderate Republicans and conservative Democrats in Congress. The result was the passage of amendments to the Fair Housing Act in 1988. It took 20 years, but the 88 amendments gave the nation and the victims of housing discrimination a fair housing law whose promise was capable of being fulfilled. The beautiful bird finally had wings. In addition to making the law more user-friendly, by extending the time within which to file a complaint, allowing attorneys' fees and costs to winning plaintiffs, increasing the remedies available, the amendments greatly strengthens HUD's enforcement powers. It was empowered to initiate investigations without waiting for private suits. It could file complaints with the Attorney General, who was required to take action. Moreover, HUD was now required to try a case before an administrative law judge if it found reasonable cause to believe that discrimination had occurred. If the defendant made such an election, the Justice Department was required to prosecute the case. Of course, legislative changes alone can't complete or create an integrated, bias-free America. Data from the 90 census show that we remain an overwhelmingly segregated society. Northern cities on average are severely segregated, with Cleveland registering the 4th highest segregation index of all metropolitan areas in the nation. Only Gary, Detroit, and Chicago are more segregated than Cleveland. At the average rate of change across all northern areas, it will take 77 years just to reach a moderate level of segregation. Although southern metropolitan areas are less segregated than their northern counterparts, it will still take 36 years for them to reduce their segregation to the moderate range. When the idea of racial justice seemed a new and popular fad some years ago, there also seemed to be an assumption achieving it would be cost-free. It hasn't been, of course. Change never is. And when it began to pinch and squeeze, its popularity began to wane. In the long run, however, the cost of achieving justice is never so great as the cost of denying it. For that cost is measured by social indicators like crime, mental illness, human decay, social disintegration. The modern movement for racial equality, stretching back in time for only a generation or so, has seen great progress made. These were years of great legal struggles in the streets. Gains were won at lunch counters, at movie theaters, at bus stations, polling places, schoolhouses. The fabric of legal apartheid in America began to come undone. But despite an impressive increase in the number of black people holding public office, despite our ability to sit and eat and ride and work and vote and live in places that used to lack black faces, in a very real way, we find our condition unchanged. A quick look at all the statistics that measure how well or how poorly a group of people are doing demonstrates that if our general condition has improved a great deal, our relative condition has actually managed to get worse. But against all evidence, I remain an optimist. I think perhaps it is inherited. My grandfather, James Bond, was born a slave in Kentucky in 1863. Today, that slave's grandson teaches at the university slave owner Thomas Jefferson founded in Virginia, and teaches young women and men about the modern-day struggle for human liberty. That struggle, of course, has its roots in Jefferson's words more than his deeds, and its parallels in my grandfather's membership in a transcendent generation, a body of black men and women born in the 19th century in servitude, freed by the Civil War, determined to make their way as free women and men. I teach my students about a more modern transcendent generation of Americans, born in segregation in the 20th century, freed from racism's restraints by their own efforts, determined to make their way in freedom. This generation shares confidence with the slave-born generation that preceded and produced them. The history of the freedom struggle is a never-ending fight between right and wrong. As evil has been consistent, so has good. As evil has sought privilege for the few, good has insisted on peace and prosperity for the many. And the movement for racial and economic justice has fought its battles on a variety of fronts, choosing each as circumstances dictated, changing and adapting its means and methods to the situation it confronted. As we continue to fight these battles, in housing, in education, in employment, we may want to remember my grandfather's hopeful words. Speaking in 1901, he said, "The false partitions set up to separate classes and races are falling down. Illogical and unchristian distinctions, though still disgracing the age and hampering the spirit of progress, must soon yield to justice and right, then forward in the struggle for advancement. Wrong," he said, "for a time may seem to prevail. The good already accomplished seem to be overthrown. But forward in the struggle, inspired by the achievements of the past, sustained by a faith that knows no faltering, forward in the struggle." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bond. It is a great honor to have you here today on this most important day. I recall just about 3 months ago, many of you were gathered with us as we celebrated our annual Martin Luther King celebration. And so being here is a very appropriate site. Mr. Bond mentioned that he had a Shaker connection with a relative. Yesterday, I found out about another Shaker connection. We have an employee in the service department. Her name is Dee Urban, and her brother-in-law wrote a biography in 1993 of Julian Bond's father, Horace Mann Bond. And I have that book today, and I'm looking forward to reading it to learn a little bit more about the link between Mr. Bond's grandfather and Julian Bond himself. So there are all sorts of Shaker connections. It's my privilege as mayor of the city of Shaker Heights to make a special presentation today. You know that our Center for Housing and Community Life has embarked on a new ad campaign. And that campaign talks about the fact that our housing service is the key to Shaker Heights. We say things like, "Give your friend a key to Shaker Heights." Our office, whether it was called the Housing Office or the Community Services Department or now the Center for Housing and Community Life, has been affirmatively marketing fair housing in Shaker Heights for over 25 years. And so it is now my privilege to present to Julian Bond a key to the city of Shaker Heights. Mr. Bond. No. With the key, Mr. Bond does not have to pay taxes, but he is a welcomed guest. I know that we have many realtors in the audience that I'm sure would love to sell you a house, Mr. Bond. I want to take a minute to mention that in our fair housing effort, Shaker Heights has again been recognized by HUD at the state level, and Dr. Ritchie and Lisa Wilmot and our law director, Cheryl King-Benford, went to Columbus on Wednesday to receive another award for local government fair housing efforts. So we're very proud of the efforts of our law department and of our city, and we're very pleased to be recognized. As we close this very special event today, I want to express particular thanks to Avery Friedman. Avery Friedman is not only a Shaker resident, He is a special friend to the city of Shaker Heights, and it is through his efforts that we have been able to move forward in our educational effort. He is available as a consultant to Lisa and to our law directors about how to move in this direction, and he is the person responsible for bringing Julian Bond today. So please join me in a round of applause for Mr. Friedman. There are many people to thank today, and I will just mention how pleased we are that Reverend Helwig and the First Baptist Church offered their beautiful sanctuary for the program. I want to thank the Law Department, Mr. Forbes, State Senator Judy Shearer, and our city council members. Several of them are sitting up in the front. All of you from the real estate industry, from the law firms, our residents, for being with us today. Thank you so much. I believe that this was a wonderful opportunity to review the 25 years that have passed, and I hope that we will continue to be optimistic about the future, and that we will, in Shaker Heights, act as a model for communities in the greater Cleveland area as we move forward for the next 25 years. Thank you very much.
To all available Shaker cars. Robbery in progress.
671952. I'll be responding for Van Aken.
Law enforcement is a challenging and demanding profession, and the Shaker Heights Police Department recognizes that in order to meet those ever-changing demands, we must seek out the most qualified and professional individuals to be part of our department. We'd like you to consider the Shaker Heights Police Department. Any police force is a reflection of the city it serves. Our department serves the city of Shaker Heights, which is located 8 miles southeast of downtown Cleveland. Shaker Heights shares borders with the city of Cleveland and the suburbs of Cleveland Heights, University Heights, Warrensville, and Beechwood. The city occupies a 6½ square mile area and is approximately 75% residential, 7% park area, and 10% commercial. Shaker is home to over 32,000 residents who take pride in their nationally recognized school system and in the excellent services provided by the police, fire, and service departments. Excellence is the tradition here in Shaker. Our community settles for nothing less. The city has created standards that others follow. It's a community recognized as one of the nation's leading suburbs. Shaker city government is well managed and fiscally sound with a strong property tax base. City officials have maintained a supportive and positive role toward the police department throughout the city's history. Shaker's population is a culturally diverse one who support and endorse their police department.
I feel a certain respect from the residents here, and that makes me feel good about my job and the community I'm serving.
I have a great deal of respect for the Shaker Heights Police, and I'm always glad to see the patrol cars around whenever I'm driving in the neighborhood. I've been impressed seeing them handle traffic accidents and other situations on the street. They're there quick, and they know what they're doing.
been a resident in Shaker Heights for 25 years now, and I think our police force is just fantastic. They're courteous, they're polite, they're professional, and they really make me feel secure here in Shaker Heights.
Shaker Heights has a police department as outstanding as the city that it serves. It has an authorized strength of 68 sworn officers and 33 civilians. The department is housed in a modern building that was completed in 1973. The Shaker Heights Police Department has distinguished itself as a leader in law enforcement by becoming accredited by the National Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. The Shaker Heights Police Department is the first municipal department to be accredited in Northern Ohio as a model police agency. Shaker Heights offers competitive salaries and benefits, as well as upward advancement within the department.
Shaker is a department that's striving for excellence, and for the right individuals, it can mean great career specialization opportunities.
As a police officer in the Shaker Heights Strike Force, I've received specialized training in various areas, including narcotics, auto theft, and burglary apprehension.
I'm fortunate to have been chosen to serve on the Shaker Heights SWAT team. The training, the challenge, the teamwork, it's why I became a police officer in the first place. I find it very rewarding for me.
Well, Ruby and I have been a K-9 team for the past 7 years in Shaker Heights, and the commitment is tremendous and the work is hard, but the payoff is great. There's nothing better than finding a burglar at the end of a track or finding a suspect hiding in a building. Without the dog, it would take us hours to find.
Watch it! Get up against the wall!
The crisis intervention team deals with barricaded suspects, hostage takers, and potential suicide victims. We use our communication skills to diffuse possible hostile situations. I chose to be a member of this unit because I enjoy the study of human behavior, and this unit has given me an opportunity to broaden my experiences in that field.
In addition to the SWAT, K-9, Crisis Intervention, and Strike Force units, Shaker also offers career opportunities in the juvenile and traffic units and criminal investigation. The Shaker Heights Police Department runs a professional department, which attracts professional people.
I am looking for the brightest and the best recruit I can find. Our performance in the street is a reflection of our personnel and my goal to have the finest suburban police department in the nation.
An integral part of a career at the Shaker Heights Police Department includes continuing education and training. Last year, training for Shaker Heights Police averaged 84 hours per officer. Our personnel were sent to Northwestern, Ohio State, and Bowling Green universities for in-depth and specialized courses. As one of the benefits, the Shaker Heights Police Department offers educational pay scale incentives.
Fire!
It's important to me that every officer I send out on the road is prepared to handle any situation. We do this through a broad spectrum of training, from criminal investigations to human relations seminars. It's important to us that all of our officers be prepared to do the very best job possible.
Along with continuing education, the Shaker Heights Police Department is constantly updating its communication and law enforcement technology.
I want my officers to have the edge when they're out there in the streets. It provides safety for them and also enhances our capabilities of reducing crime. This can be through many factors: the computerization of cars, weaponry, safety equipment that they can wear, and so forth. This new technology is an evolution change, and we want to stay on top of it for the benefit of our officers in the community.
The Shaker Heights Police Department offers excellent opportunities for professional and personal growth, an excellent work environment, competitive salary, and comprehensive benefit packages. Interested applicants can pick up their applications from the Shaker Heights City Hall at 3400 Lee Road. Applications must be returned by the applicant.
Well, in Shaker Heights, I think I found more than just a job. I found a career.
Well, I came to Shaker Heights from another police department, and here in Shaker, I'm not just another officer, I'm part of a team, so to speak.
When I say part of a team, I've been given the opportunity to get involved in some investigations and training. I've had specialized training in juvenile investigations and traffic investigations, things I wasn't afforded opportunity to prior to coming here. All in all, I think it's just a great department and I like it here.
I've been a police officer for the city of Shaker Heights for the past 11 years. And in that time, I found it to be a very rewarding and challenging career, which I believe says a lot for the police department as well as the city.
We believe other law enforcement agencies offer you a job. We in Shaker are offering you a career.